All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about while loops. And so, what is that and why is that useful? Well, what a loop is, it's something that will run many, many times in our program. And, let's start off by saying why that might be useful. Because let's say I came to you and said, hey, can you draw me 100 circles in processing, right? Just you can have them go this way or vertically. I don't care. Just draw me 100 circles. You could say, okay, I mean, I could do that, but what would you need? Well, you would need, of course, you have to say the circle command, but then each circle thing, if you want to do this, to make your code more robust, you probably need three variables for each circle. So to draw the first circle, you'd make a variable, you declare it, so you say int x1, and then somewhere you would initialize it, you would say, x1 equals 10 or whatever. Then the same thing for y1, same thing for the diameter. I have r1, but it's like the diameter, right? And then you would use the circle command. So that'd give you one circle. So with one circle, you need three variables, you need to declare them, you need to initialize them, and then you need to call the circle command. Okay, well, you've done that plenty of times already. That's not too bad. But, if you move on to, okay, let's do that again for another circle, and then for another circle, and do that for 100 circles, that's so much. Oh my gosh, it's so much code, it's so much crap you got to deal with. And, that's not what you want. And, not saying that you couldn't do it this way, you definitely could. And 100 circles, with copying and pasting, that's doable. Like I could see someone doing that, right? But what if I told you, hey, make me 1,000 circles or 10,000 circles or something like that? At some point it gets to where it wouldn't even be possible to do it, within any sort of reasonable amount of time, right? It'd be days and days and days of copying, pasting, copying, pasting, copying, pasting. It'd be a mess. Um, and so that's not what you want. And so let's talk about how we can do this in a much easier way using code and using some more sophisticated techniques. And so you may remember when we talked about variables a number of lessons ago, that actually made things a little bit easier on us in the long run. It might have been more work we had to do up front because we had to make the variables and everything. But in the long run, it made things much easier for us. So the example that I gave you back then was, let's say you drew a house, right? If you did not use variables when you drew that house, if you change one dimension of that house, like made it wider or something, well, the roof doesn't move with it. The door is no longer centered. So then you have to basically redo everything all over again. A lot of annoying work, right? But if you use variables and you define them properly, which again, that requires more work up front, but once you do that work up front, you never have to do it ever again. Because if you define things properly, if you change one dimension of that house, let's say, everything moves with it. So the roof gets wider, the door centers itself again. And of course, if you're more complicated drawing, you have all more parts. Well, they would all kind of go, you know, if you change one thing, everything would kind of go with it, right? So even though it's more work to begin with, in the long run, it makes things much, much easier, much more robust, and is much better code that way. So we're going to be talking about another thing like that. We're going to be taking another step in that direction where we will learn a new technique, and it's going to be a little bit of work up front, not that much even, but a little bit of work up front, and it's going to make things a heck of a lot easier in the long run, and that's going to be loops. And specifically, these are going to help us do lots of the same thing over and over again. So if I tell you to draw 100 circles and space them out this way, a loop will do that much, much, much less time than having to type out 100 circles and all the variables that go with them. And so loops, what is a loop? And of course, we'll talk about more specific examples pretty soon. But a loop is a block of code. So just like the setup or draw functions has the two curly braces, so it's a block of code. If statement has curly braces, it's a block of code. A loop is also a block of code, so it's going to have its curly braces. And what it does is you have, your curly braces, and code is between those two braces. And what it's going to do is going to loop between all that code in those curly braces, right? And so it's just going to run that code over and over and over again for, 10 times, 100 times, however many times you tell it to loop. So that's going to be really useful for us because it's going to run a certain, type of code over and over and over again. That could be, drawing a circle. And so maybe you'll draw a circle, draws a circle, then draws a circle over and over and over again. And then, it does all that work for us. We don't have to copy and paste the circle command 100 times. We just put the circle command once in our loop and tell the loop to run 100 iterations. Now, at some point, the loop does end. It shouldn't go on forever. It should end, and then it runs the rest of the code as usual. And so some concepts, some background stuff first before we get into the concrete code of this is there's two types of loops in processing, but also in any language, right? There are while loops and for loops. We are not going to talk about for loops today. We're going to talk about them next lesson. But while loops, we're going to start there. The reason I'm starting with while loops is because, for one, I think they're a little bit easier to kind of read and understand compared to a for loop, but they're also very similar to an if statement, at least in terms of how you write it. It's very, very similar to an if statement. It's almost the same thing even. But what does an if statement look like? Well, an if statement is, if I just come here, I'm going to do a new sketch just so we can look at what that looks like, right? An if statement says if, and then I have a condition. So something like, x is greater than 50. And let's just go ahead and make x real quick so it doesn't yell at me. Something like that, right? If x is 50 or greater than 50, or I have my curly braces, and then my block of code that should run whenever this is true. So, print line this, or x is greater than 50. Whatever, right? 50. Boop, 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 boop. So the structure here is we have the if, we have a condition that it checks, and if the condition is true, then it goes inside these curly braces and runs whatever code is between them. The while loop is going to have the exact same structure. The only difference is it's going to be, instead of if, it's going to be while. And then it's going to be some condition, x is less than 10 or something, and then some curly braces. What this is going to do is going to say while this condition is true. So not if this condition is true, but just while it's true, keep running what is going on between these curly braces. And that's going to be the basic structure. And I'll give you a more concrete example of using this here in a second as well. But hopefully that makes sense because, and here's a little slide of, a comment of how to do this. But you just write the while word. You have a condition, just like the if statement, and then your curly braces and all your code you want to run for your loop between those two curly braces. Now, let's bring up a more concrete example. So I have some code here. I will let you look at what I'm doing here. So first, I just initialized one variable. I called it x. In my setup function, I initialized it to 1. And then in my draw, I have my while loop. How did I write this? Well, I said while. So instead of if, it's while. Then my condition. In this case, I said my condition was while x is less than or equal to 100. Okay. Now, I then said, hey, print the word iteration, and then print line the value of x. The difference here, but in case you don't know, the difference between print and print line is that if you say print line, then anything I print after this will be on a new line. But that is not the case with print. If you just say print, it's going to print something out in the console like we're used to, but the next thing will not be printed on a new line. So what this is going to do is going to write out the word iteration : space. And then on the same line, it's going to give us the value of x. So it's just going to be a nice, easy way to tell us what x is. But okay, let's think about what this while loop does. It says while x is less than or equal to 100. So whenever it is less than or equal to 100, print this out, and then after it prints it out, make x go up by 1 value. So let's think about what this should do. X starts off, according to our setup, as being equal to 1. And then when it gets here, it would say, okay, while x is less than or equal to 100, well, first off, is x less than or equal to 100? Well, right now it's equal to 1, so yes, it is. So then it's going to print out the word iteration, and then print out the value of x, in this case 1. And then it's going to make x increase by 1, so now x is equal to 2. Now, because we're in a loop, it's going to actually go straight back to here, and it'll say, okay, is x still less than or equal to 100? Well, x is 2, so yes, it is. So it prints it, it makes it increase by 1, x is now equal to 3, this is still true. It keeps on going until x becomes equal to 101. When x is equal to 101, this is no longer true, and it says, oh, I'm done. And then it leaves the loop and comes down here. So what I'm even going to do, I'm going to tell it to print line loop is done. Right there. And so it should print out iteration, the value of x, between 1 and 100, And after all that, it will print out the sentence loop is done. So let's give that a shot here. So my window doesn't do anything because I told it not to. Actually. Here, I'm going to comment this out for a second, and then we'll put it back, and we'll talk about what's going on here. So if I do this, first off, you can see, we'll scroll up to the top. It says iteration is 1, because x started off as 1. It then said, okay, increase x by 1. It stayed in the loop, printed out iteration is 2. Then it kept going, loop, 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 loop. X is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up until x is 100. Now, after that, I can't scroll down anymore. That's as far as it went, right, with my console. And so after that, x is now equal to 101. So then it comes after here, and now this is no longer true, right? So even though the draw starts over, this condition is no longer true, so it doesn't run this while loop again. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to put this back. I'm going to stop it very quickly. Press play, stop. Ooh, maybe not quick enough. Let's see. Let's see. No, we can. Cool. But you see now, iteration, same thing, 1 through 100. And then it says loop is done. But then it kept saying loop is done, loop is done, loop is done, loop is done. You know, why did it print the stuff in the while loop only once? You know, it went through the while loop only once. But then after that, it does this sentence on until forever. Like if I let it run longer, it would just keep going and going and going and going. Why is that? Well, if you remember, what does draw do? Well, draw itself is also a loop. It's going to loop over and over and over again on until forever until you click stop. Okay, so that kind of explains why this is going on forever, because it's in the draw, right? So it prints, it prints, it prints, it prints, it prints. Once, you know, it reaches this, it's going to print it on until forever until we click stop because it's in draw. But this first bit of stuff where it prints out the iteration value, you know, these lines right here, it went through these through one loop, but it did not do it anymore. Why do you think that is? Well, what I'm also going to do is not just print loop is done. I'm also going to print, actually, you know what? I'm going to say here, loop is done, and x is equal to that. And then after this, I'll say print line x. If I press play, stop it real quick. Now you see if I move this back up, I can still see it did the iterations once, and then it said loop is done and x equal to 101. And then it was just always equal to 101, right? And so if we think about what happened here, in my setup, at the very beginning of my program, when I first pressed play, x was made to 1. This while loop, it checked the condition. It was true. It made it increase by 1. Then it went up, 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 up. You know, it did the while loop thing. X was then equal to 101 after that. And so then it printed this out. And then draw starts back over. It goes to the while loop. But x is still equal to 101. So this is false. So it never goes back into the loop. So it just stays here. So hopefully that makes sense. But what if you have something where you do want to run this while loop every time in draw? You want this to repeat every time in draw. What can we do? Well, and I'm going to go back to my original message here. What we can do is instead of having this x equals 1 in setup, which is run only once whenever you first press play, what if I take it and put it in draw right before my while loop? If I put it in draw right before my while loop, what do we think is going to happen? Well, it's going to say while this is true, you know, does the loop thing. It then says loop is done. It then starts over, and instead of leaving x at 101, it reassigns x to be equal to 1. Well, now this condition is true again, so then it repeats the loop. It goes on from there. At least that's what I think is going to happen. Let's press play and find out. Press play. I'm going to stop it real quick because it's going to run a lot now. I'm going to just go on to the very top here. You can see it looped all the way through. Loop, 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 loop. It said loop is done, and then it started going through the while loop again. Loop is done. Over and over again. On, forever, however long I left it running for, right? It kept going and going and going. And so that's kind of how it works. That's all I really have to say today in terms of how to write a while loop. However, before we move on, I do want to talk about some potential problems that you may face with a while loop. And this is the case for any loop. This is, dangerous loop stuff, is if you're looping and you have a while loop or a for loop or something that loops forever, it's going to break your program. You're stuck in an infinite loop, right? And so you're never going to be able to do anything else in your code. You're going to be stuck in that loop forever. And that's a big, big problem. And so the reason this makes things mess up in processing is because, remember, this draw function here, we never see anything happen. Nothing's ever displayed on the screen until it reaches the end of draw. Once it reaches the end, it displays something, and then it starts back over in draw, runs the code again, displays. But let's imagine we got stuck in this while loop. We were stuck there forever. But we would never reach the end of draw. So because of that, we would never see anything on the screen, right? So let's say if I was trying to draw a circle or 100 circles using my while loop, I would never ever see that happen because I would be stuck in this while loop. And so, yeah, let's talk about how that could be an issue and what we can do to make sure that doesn't happen. First off, well, actually, let's just jump straight into an infinite example, and then let's talk about how we can get out of it, right? And so I have here very similar thing, and it's a different sketch, but it's very similar. I made a variable, declared it as x, initialized it to be 1. I then have my while loop here, x less than or equal to 100. I mean, you're putting the same stuff, but you see here, I have x instead of +1. Let's say I made a mistake. Instead of having that, let's say I accidentally pressed +0. I then said, okay, draw a circle. So we should see, and I'm very exact. I didn't even use variables here, so I was very explicit about where I want it. So what we expect is I should see a circle drawn on the screen when I press play, and then this will just print stuff over and over again. But let's see what happens if I press play. Okay, that's weird. There's my window, but there's no circle. So I'm not even seeing it. And you see, I'm also getting some weird stuff down here in my while loop. It's saying iterations 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. That's never even increasing. And I don't see anything drawn here. But what's strange is because I told it very specifically, hey, draw this circle at this position. But I'm not seeing anything. And this is flipping out. Something's going wrong here. And so that's weird. And so, let's say I don't know why this is happening, but I suspect it has something to do with the loop. If I comment that out, where it's not going to run the loop anymore, so the way I did that, instead of just highlight it and press Control/, you can do Command/ on Mac. Let's say I do that. If I press play, I see my circle. My circle is there. So that means that there's something in this bit of code that is preventing this circle from being drawn. Okay. So if I put it back and press play, I don't see the circle anymore. Okay, so that's a problem. The reason is because this is an infinite loop. I'm stuck inside this while loop. X is initialized to be 1, which means that, hey, this is true, this condition is true, so it comes in here, but X is never going to be greater than or equal to, or greater than 100. It's always going to be less than 100. It's going to always be 1, in fact, right now. So this condition is always going to be true, so we just stay in this loop forever. We never get out of it. So because we never get out of it, we never even reach this line of code. It never runs the line of code to draw the circle. And so that's a big problem. And the reason is because we don't have X ever increasing. Because here, since X is checking to see if it's less than 100, you can imagine for this not to be true, X has to become at some point greater than 100. So we need to have something to make that happen at some point. So that's what this line is. This is called the exit condition. The exit condition makes sure that at some point in your program, you will leave the while loop. You'll leave the loop at some point. If you don't have that, things will go very, 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 very wrong. So if I just make this +1, well, we know at some point X is increasing, so at some point it's going to be equal to or greater than 100, we know that we'll at least exit the loop at some point. So let's press play here. And you can see, I see my circle. That part's fixed. It's printed everything out like normal. We're back to our happy place. Everything's working. Nothing's freaking out on us now, so that's nice. And so hopefully that makes sense. So make sure you always have that exit condition, or else things are going to freak out on you. All right. And so really, I guess there's 3 parts in making a while loop. There is what I call the initialization of the variable, and it's the variable that you use in this condition, right? So you're going to be using something in that condition. It's almost always a variable. I don't know if I can think of an instance where it's not a variable. But you have a variable. You need to initialize that to some value. You can do that in your setup. You can do that anywhere, but it's very common to put it in your setup, or sometimes you will do it right in front of the while loop. It depends. If you're in my class and you're going to do the daily assignment today, the checkerboard, you'll kind of work through about why that makes a difference. But you always need to initialize that variable. You need the while loop itself, so you need to say while the condition and the basic structure. You also need the exit condition. You need something to make sure that at some point this condition is false, so you can leave the while loop. If you don't have these 3 things, you cannot make use of a while loop. And so that's it for my lecture. Today's a much shorter one, and so that is great. I will say, go ahead, if you're in the class, go ahead and get started on the daily assignment, which is the checkerboard assignment. I'm going to open up that just to show you what it looks like. Here, I'll pause the recording. All right, so what I have here is a checkerboard that I've made using some while loops. So that's kind of cool. Lots of variables, and I'm using while loops because what I could do is I could say, hey, draw, a teal square, and then draw like a navy blue square, then a teal square, then a blue square, and then manually do it like that. And I could do all that, but that would be a lot of work, a lot of copying and pasting. Annoying. Don't like it. So instead what I did is I used while loops to draw some of these different squares. I also use a Boolean to flip the colors of this. And so I said, if the Boolean is true, make it one color. If it's false, make it the other color. And so, yeah, that's that. What's kind of cool about this as well, I won't go too far, is because I use variables and while loops. If I make my window bigger, you see it also, the squares go along with it. Without while loops, if you just did this manually, this would not work, right? So let's even make it a bit tall. Just make it a little bit shorter. You see, whatever size I give it, it's going to fill it up with squares, which is kind of neat, right? I'm even going to let's do like 750. See how it looks? Yeah. So you can see, no matter what size I give it, I can fill it up with this checkerboard pattern, which is kind of cool. And so that's a pretty interesting challenge here. If you get this complete, you'll have a very good understanding of while loops. And so I wish you the best of luck. Thank you so much.